Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple different reasons. First of which, just take my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week and move into the process of actually writing and preparing the sermon that I'm going to preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason. And the second is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason brought you here today, to gain some different insight into the assigned text for the week. So that's why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is September 17th, 2017, the 15th Sunday after Pentecost, our gospel lesson comes out of Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. Now, this happens to be a direct continuation of the gospel lesson that we had last week. We had the little section verses 15 through 20. And if you happen to catch the video last week, I also kind of included this first portion or at least I talked about it in the course of the sermon because I thought it was pretty applicable. Jesus is in a process right now of talking about the importance of forgiveness, that not only are we forgiven by God and through the mercy and the grace of God, which of course we are, but that the importance of offering that mercy and that forgiveness to one another, particularly in the church. And that's really kind of what he's talking about, that we are called to be different in the world. We are called to be those shining lights of reflecting the love of God in the world, the mercy of God in the world. And so we are called to forgive as we have been forgiven. That's kind of what Jesus is talking about through this section. And so as he's been talking about that, it starts off with Peter then asking a question that really, in a lot of ways, is a direct continuation of that. So that's kind of where we pick up. So I'm going to start off with that. That's only like the first couple of verses. And then Jesus kind of answers the question of Peter with a parable. And we're kicking off some more parables. If you've seen my videos before, you know that parables are not always my favorite things. They at times can be difficult to really wrap our heads around and to try and preach on, and yet here we are. So another parable this time around. So let's go ahead and jump in. Keep in mind, Jesus, again, has been talking about the importance of forgiveness, and he has just said, wherever two or three are gathered, I'm there among them. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church, that should actually be a brother or sister, sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times, or sometimes it's translated 70 times 7. The Greek's a little ambiguous there. I'm going to stop there and talk just a tiny little bit about that. Why 7? What's important about that? Well, in the Jewish culture, 7 was the number of completion. We see in the scriptures a lot just the significance of numbers. There are some different numbers that tend to come around a lot. 7 is one. It's the number of completion. 3 is important because of the Trinity, 3 and 1. Also, the third day being the day of the resurrection. 7 is important because of the act of creation, that God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day established the Sabbath, that God rested. So that's kind of a big one. 40 is another big one. It's all over the Old Testament and aspects of the New Testament as well. Excuse me. But so 7 is the number of completion or perfection. Sometimes we'll hear it said as well. So I think that's why Peter chooses 7. It's not like he just pulled a number out of the air when he was asking, well, how many times do I have to forgive my brother or sister if they sin against me and repent of it? And he says even 7 times, because that's completion. So that should be all the more we need. And Jesus pretty much tells him, you're nowhere close. It's way, way more than that. Whether it's 77 or 70 times 7, it's way more than you could ever quantify. I think that's really what's going on. And now we're going to transfer into this parable where Jesus begins to illustrate this point. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the recounting, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and he could not pay. And as he could not pay, the Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, pay what you owe. Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused, and he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have mercy on your fellow slave, as I have had mercy on you?' And in his anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." All right, so that's the parable, that's the gospel. And it's really an illustration about this unending need for mercy, to show mercy to one another, to show compassion, to show forgiveness, to offer forgiveness to those who ask of it, to those who repent, to those who are our brothers and sisters, who hint, I think, is everyone. Some different points that come up that I think about. The astronomical nature of the debt here is something that's of worth noting. We hear two different monetary values that might be quite foreign to us. We hear at first 10,000 talents. Now, maybe you've heard of the parable of the talents, the parable of the 10 and the 5 and the 1, or the 3 and the 2 and the 1, or different parables out there. But so a talent is the equivalent of 15 years worth of wages for a day laborer in Jesus' time. And so for a loan to be 10,000 talents, we're looking at approximately the value of 150,000 years worth of work. You think you can pay that off? Probably not. Now, why does Jesus choose this in the telling of the parable? I don't know. But it seems to me to be indicating the immeasurable depth of this debt. The word value comes to mind, but I hesitate to use that because I don't want us to think that we can place value or place quantity upon sin, upon the debt, upon the mercy of God. And so maybe that's why when Jesus is talking to Peter, he says this astronomical amount of 70 times, or 70 times 7, or 77 times. And then when he starts talking about the debt that is forgiven, he brings out this immeasurable amount, this amount of value, this amount of money that no one in their right mind would ever even begin to fathom. I mean, what king can come up with that amount of money? And I'm not going to do the math now. I haven't done it ahead of time, but to tell you, like, even considering like the average wage of someone here in the U.S. and what 150,000 years worth of salary would be, but it's a big number, and so we see this huge debt that is not only is the consequence of not being able to pay that foregone, but the debt is forgiven. The debt is erased. The debt is taken away. And so that's amazing. The mercy that's been shown to the slave, it's supposed to be beyond our ability to comprehend. It should be, because that echoes, or that is just a little glimpse of the immeasurable mercy that God has shown each one of us out of his great love for us. So that's the first part of that. Well, and then we see that this slave who's been forgiven this immeasurable debt goes out and finds one of his debtors, one of the people that owes him money, and it's 100 denarii. Okay, well, what's that? A denarii is the typical daily wage of a laborer. So 100 denarii we would consider to be like 3.5 months worth of salary. Now, is this still a big amount? Sure, it is. But is it something that's payable? Yeah, it is. Is it something that the guy could theoretically work off? Yeah, it is. Yet his plea for mercy, because he is unable to pay it at that moment, is the same as what the first guy said to the king, to the Lord. And I mean, in the Greek, it's literally the same. In the English, it's worded slightly different, but it's have patience with me and I will pay you everything. It's the same plea for mercy. Just be patient with me and I will repay my debt. But the first guy cannot repay that, cannot show that same mercy. He demands it. And so he does what he himself had been threatened with, the punishment of throwing them in jail until he pays it off. Now, I think that's funny because if the guy's sitting in jail, how can he earn anything to pay you back? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense at all. But in this whole thing, we see where we begin to catch a little glimpse of perhaps the social structure of this king and the slave and the other slave, that for the first guy to be considered to have a debt so huge, it's likely that he would have been really high up escalating pyramid, that he would have been like an overseer of many, many levels below him, and like a pyramid scheme. So many different people underneath him, all adding level by level by level until this humongous, I don't know if that's the right word, but this humongous responsibility falls to one guy. And that's what he can't redo for the king. But consider that if the king had still made him pay it, now this guy is going to have to go down the ladder, and everyone below him is going to be affected by this, one way or the other. Like if he still has to pay it, he's going to turn the cranks on it, which is exactly what we see him doing to the second slave. But if on the flip side he's been forgiven, and he reflects that, then everyone below him will be affected by that in a positive way. Their debts likewise should be canceled or should be forgiven or erased, just as his was, because his responsibility affects those around him. And yet we see that he does not pass that on, that the mercy that's been shown to him, not only is it just like a one-to-one thing, like I've been shown mercy, so I'm going to show you mercy, and the level is so much different, but it's the idea that the blessings, the mercy of God shown upon us, when it reflects a change within us, affects those around us. It changes the world around us. This is a way that the presence of the kingdom reflected within us changes the world for the better, better reflects the coming of the kingdom in the here and now. I think that's a good stopping point. There's other stuff that I could talk about, but that's kind of the direction that I'm leaning with this, that we remember that we can't quantify mercy, we can't quantify sin or brokenness, and that's not what this talent or this parable about the talents is about. It's not about trying to create the image of a scoreboard. Maybe I'm thinking about that because today, as I'm recording this, happens to be our homecoming day here in my town, and so I'm thinking about football, and I'm thinking about the scoreboard and watching the score and all of that. But there is no scoreboard. There is no quantity. There is no quantifiable way of thinking about brokenness or sin or mercy or God's grace or any of that. And that's important to keep in mind and to consider. So if you have thoughts or questions or comments based on this, by all means, throw those down in the comment section. We'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we will catch you next time.